if you look at what's happening with either climate or with some of the other global environmental deals and agreements, such as biodiversity, the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are a lot of buzzwords that are around us these days. Climate COP26, of course, was net zero. With the Biodiversity Convention, it's things like no net loss. So essentially, what we're seeing is, as you already pointed out, what we're seeing is the system coming up with or trying to come up with so-called solutions that are essentially ways by which it wants to sustain itself, not necessarily the earth. And to do that in a way which appears to be green and clean and inclusive and all of that, because now they know, the corporations of the world and the governments of the world know that they can no longer deny the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis or the pollution crisis. So then the next best thing is, okay, accept it and then try and find so-called solutions that actually not just sustain the status quo, but in fact give them opportunities for even more profit making and even more authoritarian tendencies. And so net zero is just like that. I think there are 5 or 6 very serious problems with the approach of net zero, or in the case of biodiversity, with no net loss. So with net zero, as possibly Soumya and others may have already mentioned, there is no necessary attempt to reduce emissions in the first place. But they can continue, and then somebody somewhere is going to capture that, whether it's carbon or other greenhouse gases, will be capturing that. And so eventually, magically, you end up with zero greenhouse gases or zero carbon in the atmosphere, right? That's the theory. Now, there are several problems with this. Number one, if you look at the sources of emissions, of whether it's carbon or any of the other greenhouse gases, such as, say, a thermal power station, coal-fired thermal power station, the emissions are not only the greenhouse gases. There are a number of other things that are coming out. There's nitrogen oxides, there are sulfur dioxide, there's dust, there's so many other things that are coming out. Now, supposing through magic, and I'll come to that point about how it's basically lots of magic right now, if you're able to capture, say, the carbon somewhere else, what about all the damage that's being caused by the other pollutants, which are then completely lost? Because right now everybody's focus is on just climate and more or less just carbon, right? So either the populations around or the wildlife or the forest is still going to continue to suffer. And one can then say, well, that's collateral damage for what we're trying to do. The second big issue is that a lot of the so-called carbon capture, or what's called, I think, CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage technologies, are still in the realms of science fiction. Work on CCUS have actually been going on for the last few decades, and in most cases have still not proven to be technologies that are feasible on a large enough scale and a fast enough scale to be able to capture all the carbon that's already been emitted and more that's going to continue to be emitted, because we're not actually significantly reducing the emissions over the next couple of decades or more. So it's very clear that if you say that by 2050 there'll be net zero, or in India's case 2070, or China 2060, and with no targets, staggered targets saying, okay, by 2025 it'll be this much, 2030 it'll be this much, etc., you could end up actually being in a situation where there's no net reduction, there's no reduction in emissions per se, and you're banking on technologies that might emerge in 2040 or 2045 and say, oh, well, suddenly magically we'll be capturing all the carbon. The third crucial issue, the third way in which people are saying this will happen is by having much greater amounts of vegetation which will absorb the carbon dioxide in the air, right? So forests, plantations, etc. Oceans, and I'll come back to the oceans also in a minute. Now, it's been estimated that if you really want to be able to absorb just all the carbon that's going into the atmosphere and will continue to go up, you need something like 700 million hectares of new forest or plantation. That's an area equivalent to Brazil. Now, where is that land going to come from? And whose land will it be? Is a question that nobody is asking. It's not like there's 700 million hectares of land just lying vacant somewhere, which nobody is using, which then suddenly you will be able to afforest and be able to absorb all that carbon dioxide. So this is a major issue. We know in India, for instance, that a lot of virtually all the targets for what's called compensatory afforestation. So you allow a dam to be built somewhere which submerges 1,000 hectares of forest, and you say, well, plant 2,000 hectares of forest somewhere else. We know that most of those targets have never been met. They're there on paper, but there's no actual forest on the ground. At the most, there might be plantations of one or two species, which are really in no way compensating the forest that's been lost. And that's also then the problem with the so-called no net loss in the biodiversity arena, where, I mean, you get ridiculous stuff like, for instance, I think about 5,000 or 10,000, no, so about 20,000 acres of rainforest in the Nicobars is slated for destruction to create a mega port and sports and various other such things, another sort of Singapore apparently. And where is the compensatory afforestation? It will be in Madhya Pradesh, where there's no way anybody with any kind of magic can actually recreate a rainforest that's grown for millions of years in the Nicobars. So there's all these sorts of problems. There will be displacement of people. Again, with compensatory afforestation in India, we know that people's lands are taken, either common lands, which they are dependent on, so-called wastelands, which they are dependent on, or sometimes even private lands, or lands on which they don't yet have tenure because it's never been properly acknowledged. The fourth major issue with this is that some of the proposals for this kind of net zero for the carbon capture, etc., are actually outrightly dangerous. You're talking about increasing the absorption capacity of the oceans, for instance, by pumping enormous amounts of chemicals into it, which will suddenly magically enable the oceans to absorb that much more carbon. What does it do to the aquatic life? What will it do to the ocean's dynamics on which the earth and all life actually depends? That nobody is actually looking at. The costs of that will be paid by somebody maybe 50 years from now, the next generation or the generation after that. And actually with this 2050, 2060, 2070, they're very clever, because the current lot of politicians who is promising this thing are never going to be there. So who do you hold accountable if those targets are not even met? If Mr. Modi says 2070, he's not going to be here. Whether his party will be in power or not, nobody knows. Who will be held accountable? So what you're basically doing is that you're postponing solutions more and more and more, and passing them on to next generations of decision makers, next generation of young people, etc., to be able to take care of it if you don't actually succeed. Fifth or sixth point is that very little discussion is taking place on methane. Is one of the most dangerous greenhouse gases. It's less long lasting than carbon, and so therefore a lot of attention is on carbon. But methane is also very crucial, and I haven't yet seen, at least in the India statements, any significant discussion on this. And I'm talking especially about industrial livestock production and green revolution agriculture. So if you take all of these things into account, you have to not only point to the fact that this is a lot of very dangerous and diverting greenwash, where, as I said, the system is basically just trying to sustain itself rather than the earth, but also then actually say, what do we think are the alternatives? And that I'll spend 2 or 3 minutes on that, and then I'll finish. If we look at it, we actually have, if it's the energy sector, for instance, electricity sector, where we need electricity in our houses, there are so many proven technologies of so-called renewable energies, costs of which have significantly gone down. And especially if you include the ecological and social costs of coal and big hydro and nuclear and so on, then in fact, decentralized renewable energy from solar, wind and other sources becomes eminently feasible. Not just technically feasible, financially feasible, but also much better in terms of the democratic control of communities over technology, over energy, because otherwise you have centralized energy production, including with solar and wind, by the way. big mega parks that are being already built in India, and more are being planned. Um, People have no control over those. So if you're thinking of climate, energy, etc., also being something that leads to, I mean, solutions that also lead to more democratic controls and more democratic rights, then we have to go in for decentralized renewable energy. But there's a caveat here, which is very important, which nobody is talking about in policy making, which is how much energy do we actually really need? So in India, the policy has always been whatever energy is being demanded, let's meet that with supply from somewhere or the other, right? And any source of energy, however clean it might be, is not going to be sustainable if our energy demands keep going up and up and up and up, and we keep trying to meet them. And so the issue of whose energy demand, how much energy demand, the redistribution of energy, the equitable redistribution of energy, even what's being produced right now, so that poor people who don't have enough of it are actually able to get it. And where luxury demands on energy are reduced and eliminated, that whole sector, that whole part of the equation is not being spoken about. And unless we do that, there is no way we will reach ecological sustainability or equality in these spheres. And so one also then needs to look at other sectors which are not necessarily about electricity, but about energy consumption. So for instance, transportation. Why do we have transportation policies which still focus very heavily on the private? I mean, we need to be moving over the next 10 to 15 years into cities that actually significantly emphasize public transportation, cycling, and walking, and squeeze the private car more and more and more, as is happening in some other parts of the world, right? Or you take construction. Our construction sector is amongst the most energy inefficient in the world, whereas we in fact have thousands of years of proven construction technology, traditional, and then you can add some modern elements into it, which would be much more climate friendly, much more ecologically friendly, and much more friendly to the people living inside in terms of weather and just the comfort of living. And there are so many people in cities also who are actually showing how that's possible. And finally, in agriculture, that we know in Telangana, for instance, 5,000 Dalit women farmers are producing enough food for themselves, but also to sell some in the market, and were completely independent during the entire COVID period, using only organic, using only local seeds, using only rainwater. It's possible everywhere in the country to do that without chemical fertilizers, without pesticides, without large-scale irrigation projects taking water from hundreds of kilometers. It is possible to do that. And I'm not talking only about the zero budget thing, which suddenly now even the Prime Minister has become very fond of. I'm talking about very, very diverse, localized solutions that farmers themselves have come up with, many thousands of years old, many new ones. And if we have to move towards climate-friendly agriculture, which we traditionally always had, then these are the solutions that are already available. So in all of these things, I think there's a lot more that can be done, needs to be done, first to challenge these false solutions, and then to say, actually, what are the genuine alternatives?